So David and Richard, I think we should get going.
Yep.
We're a little bit past the start and everyone's logged in and ready to go. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for From the Edge, a special edition, part 2. Some of you may have tuned in last September, I believe, and heard Richard and David talk about this topic. And there's a lot going on in this topic. There's been lots of developments since we had the talk, and many people have also watched the previous episode on our website, which is great. So a lot of interest in this topic around nature and its effect on us humans, and how that may impact or should impact interior design and architecture. So again, I'd like to welcome everyone. Professor Taylor, thank you for joining us again, and our amazing host, Mr. David Trubridge, dialing in from New Zealand, will take over, and we'll talk about, we'll talk actually a lot, even our title of the talk is a little bit up for grabs in terms of biophilic design and other definitions, but I'll turn it over to David and take it away, please.
Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa. Hi, everybody. This is David Trubridge from New Zealand, as John said, and welcome, Richard. Hey, thanks for coming back and extending our conversation. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you.
What we thought we'd do was just, would you mind, Richard, just giving us a very brief recap of what we talked about last year, just to bring people who haven't actually seen that first episode up to date, so they know where we're going to take off from here.
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, I have a bit of an unusual background. I'm head of a physics department, but I've been to art school as well. So I've always been interested in merging art and science, and that's what gravitated me towards nature's patterns. And I think, like everybody probably here, I was particularly interested in this idea of biophilia and the fact that humans have this intrinsic need to connect to nature. And, you know, I was very much inspired by sort of the psychology experiments that started in the 90s, showing the profound positive impacts that you can have on your body by looking out at a natural scene. And so I was very interested in trying to figure out what is it about a natural scene that is triggering all of these effects that can, include stress reduction and reduction of mental fatigue, and, you know, a whole host of positive things. And from my science background, I'd been studying fractal patterns, and very briefly, fractals sound weird, but all that they are is a pattern that repeats at different size scales. So a tree is a great example. You have big branches, smaller branches, and smaller branches, and smaller branches. And when you look out on a typical natural scene, it's absolutely loaded with lots of fractal patterns. So trees, clouds, rivers, mountains, lightning, coastlines, they've all been shown to be fractal over the years by people scanning in image and doing computer analysis of them. So for about 20 years, I've been working with psychologists, trying to trace whether, you know, positive impacts like stress reduction can be traced back to fractal patterns. And all of the experiments that we've been doing have been showing that seems to be the case. And so after 20 years, I really now feel that it's time to take those basic experiments in psychology and apply them to, you know, design and architecture, and actually start thinking about building designs that are human-centered and science-informed, based on the fact that we think that fractals will reduce people's stress levels.
Can you explain to me, one thing that interests me in this discussion is the difference between fractal patterns, which are, as you say, the same sort of pattern repeated on different scales.
Yeah.
And simple pattern recognition that we see, like if I'm walking in the forest, my kind of brain tunes into the pattern of leaves around me. And if I see a break in that pattern, then I'm going into an alarm situation. Maybe that's a threat to me. And it's a very deeply ingrained instinct in us, isn't it? That that we're very quick to spot something over there that's tiny, little thing that breaks that pattern.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between just simple pattern recognition and our response to fractals, which is that reducing scale?
Yeah, great question. I mean, our human visual system is absolutely remarkable. It's literally 2 billion pieces of information are flying down our optic nerves every second that our eyes are looking at something. So your brain is getting bombarded by information. And when you're actively looking at something, it can be up to 30% of your brain is dedicated to try and understand what on earth is it that you're looking at. And so through evolution, we've come a long way. You know, our visual system started off as just a little patch of light sensitive material, trying to just decide, did something move or not? All the way through to today, where we've got those billions of pieces of data that our poor brains have to understand. So the brain has to have strategies, processing strategies, to try and understand all of that information. And what it's trained itself on through evolution, what stimuli has it used to try and hone its skills and its fractal patterns? That it's very recently that we've gone into these rectangular boxes of Euclidean designs, that our ancestors have been surrounded every day by fractal patterns. And like you say, David, what to stay alive, what our visual systems have essentially had to do is continually scan that fractal scenery. And what it's doing is confirming that all that you've got is fractals in that scenery. Because what you need to know is there a tiger, which is a non-fractal object, hiding in there? So all of our research, what we call fractal fluency, the idea that the visual system has become fluent in this visual language of fractals. What it's doing is we're scanning a scene unbeknownst to us, because this is all automatic and occurring at millisecond levels. What we're doing is scanning and confirming that all we've got is a fractal. And then when we know that, that's what ushers in the relaxation. And because we've acquired that behavior through millions of years, our visual systems actually want to do it. So for example, MRI studies looking at different parts of the brain show that when you're doing that search, it triggers something called the default mode network. And that's something which we use a lot when we're daydreaming and relaxing. It's like an idling system. And that shows that, you know, when we're doing that search, it's not hard for us. It's not hard work for us. It's actually what our visual systems are designed to do. So when we look on that scene and your eye starts to search, your whole body relaxes because it's now operating on a level that it wants to do. So the difference between, you know, pattern recognition and fractals is really that our pattern recognition tools have been trained on fractal stimuli. And that's what they're designed to look at.
And the clever thing is that the tiger will itself take on fractal patterns to make it hide, so we don't recognize it. So there's this sort of little game going on all the time, isn't it? Trying to outwit each other.
Yeah, and actually the US Army has a patent on fractal camouflage for exactly that reason, you know. And so, yeah, evolution's this clever game, isn't it? Of one,
yeah,
you know, and then one adapts, and then the next has to adapt.
So that's the sort of background to the fractal story. Let's bring it into interior design.
Yeah.
And I wanted to sort of just very briefly bring up this issue of biophilic, the word biophilic design. Now, my personal understanding of biophilic design is slightly different to maybe what most people see it as. I think if you go online, you Google biophilic design, you see pictures of trees and green walls inside houses. And that's nice, it's bringing nature indoors. But to me, it's more a process. It's the way in which we design is more like the way nature evolves rather than, so it's encouraging a kind of a community evolution of stuff to kind of all come together and be this thing rather than imposing, like you say, the Euclidean box of contemporary design on us, which doesn't allow all that stuff to happen. Is that sort of your take on it as well?
Absolutely. There's a a massive difference between biomimicry and bioinspiration. And mimicry, you're just copying something. So you might take a photograph of a forest and hang it on your wall. Now that only takes you so far because you're not walking in a forest. You have to acknowledge that when you sat in a room doing whatever, you might be teaching students or you might be going into surgery or something. That is fundamentally a different situation than when you're walking in a forest. So we have to take the fractal patterns that we know that we like when we're walking in a forest, but then adapt it to allow for and respect the fact that when you walk into a room and, for example, put fractal carpets down, that is very different experience than walking in a forest. And so what we have to do is start off being inspired by those fractal trees and then adapt them. And actually the thing in the background is a great example, because that's a pattern that we developed with Mohawk for carpets and actually for screensavers as well. And that is inspired by nature's fractals. But if you look close, it's got these little white lines and things like that, things that have been changed to recognize that we're not just copying nature, that we're learning from it and we're going to adapt to it. Yeah, and there's another great example. And so that's where all the fun and games come in as a designer, is that you have to allow for all of these extra things that don't occur in nature. Like, for example, here, what if you're going to block part of the pattern with a table or some chairs? That sort of thing doesn't go on in nature. Nature doesn't have to worry about that. But we as designers or architects do. And so, yeah, for me, biophilia is not just copying nature. It's learning from it and then respecting the fact that you're putting it into this very different environment.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us to the coral light, because the shadow patterns that are created by the coral light are quite kind of open, and there's not a lot of detail happening in there.
Yeah.
And I would say that probably, you haven't mentioned this, but in previous talks, you talked about the D scale, the level of fractal complexity from 0, which is a white sheet, to 10, which is a black sheet. And in between, you fill in the white with lines to make it black.
Yeah.
So coral is right down the bottom. It's like, it's not the mid-range that we instinctively respond to, which is what we see in nature, which is what we've been tuned and programmed to relate to. It's lower down. And yet, if I made it as complicated as that mid-range of the sort of patterns that we see in nature, it'd be too complex.
Yeah.
So what's happening there? Why is the coral working well? Why do people love its shadow patterns, even though they're not actually that optimum D scale range that we evolved to like?
Yeah, and again, these are what I really enjoy, because these are both challenges in a sense, but challenges in the great sense that we've got to figure it all out rather than a worrying limitation. So one of the exciting things for me is that this really is, you know, human-based design, that we're going to really now get serious and think about what the human being needs when they're looking at this pattern. So there's several things going on with the design then. First is that, of course, not all humans are the same. So, you know, this mid-D that we talk about, that's sort of like a global, what most people prefer under most circumstances. But we do have subgroups of people. What we call the smoothies like much simpler things. The sharpies like much more detailed things. We're still at a stage where we don't understand who is a sharpie and who is a smoothie. So we've got all of that to learn, that there's going to be variations from people, and that could be to do with what they've been exposed to in their lives. There's also a pathological thing. So, you know, people have started to study artists, and Willem de Kooning, when he descended into Alzheimer's, he actually started to prefer simpler things. So there's a human-centered part of it, but there's also the functionality side of it as well, that when we're deciding a fractal pattern, what works in a dentist waiting room might be different than what works in a hospice situation, might be different from what works when you're running for an airplane in an airport. And basically, I think within all of that, David, to kind of answer your question, what you've got to do is when you're factoring out the fractal complexity of something that you're looking at, you have to take into account the complexity of the background and what's going on. And what we're finding is that if you embed a fractal in a very simple background, for example, putting fractal carpets into an empty room where you've got empty walls and empty ceilings, that simplicity, that surrounding simplicity, brings up your tolerance for fractal complexity. And it works the other way around as well. So it might be that when you're looking at that, you know, the pattern that you were talking about, it might be that there's a lot of background complexity. And so you start to crave the more simplicity, simpler versions of the fractal when you're looking at it.
So you're saying that it's the overall effect that we have to think about rather than the individual effect of one item that we're doing is the sum of all those fractals that we're being exposed to within that space is the important thing. So the space has to be designed as a whole.
Yeah. And that's where we're at right now. So we've nailed everything down in terms of psychology experiments, doing, you know, images on monitors, which is nice. It's in a controlled environment. But if we're going to go practical, we've got to quickly go into testing these in real life situations where there's people walking around and you're doing tasks and things like that. Does the fractal work in that environment, and what particular fractal? Because that's a very different experience than sitting in a psychology lab, in a nice quiet lab with deliberately no distractions. It's going to be all to do with context. And I know that one of the things that we want to talk about today about context is it's not just visual. You've got sonic, and you've got drafts of air, and you've got tactile experiences. And we're starting to use this word atmospheric fractals because you can not just generate visual fractals, but you can have sounds. So for example, sounds of running water, sounds of birds singing, those are fractal as well. So you could hit all of your different senses and immerse the person into a full experience. And that's where we've got to go in the end. And when you walk through the woods, that's what you're getting exposed to. And it's just that when we walk through a building, it's going to be a different experience.
So how's the sound of a bird song a fractal? Because I mean, it's basically it's a tune. It's a number of notes repeated.
There are two ways that you could do it. So if you imagine, you know, what makes a mountain fractal, you know, what you could do is analyze that sort of shape. And some people analyze music where they analyze the notes on the piece of paper, but most people do it by a frequency content. And, you know, how much, you know, when you were talking about the complexity, the D value, that's looking at how much fine structure have you got versus coarse structure. With the music, you could look at how much high pitch have you got compared to low pitch. It's looking at those frequency distributions. So kind of music fractals are kind of looking at the pattern in time, while visually you're looking at the pattern in space.
Yeah. And John, can you just bring back that image you had just now of the solar and the coral? Because the solar, which is a more intense pattern, was throwing its shadows on a white wall. The coral, which is a more open pattern, is showing throwing its shadows on a textured wall. And so you're effectively getting your fractals from the brickwork that's already there. And in some ways, I think I prefer that. For me, visually, it's more interesting than the one on the left, which is a bit more open and sort of one-dimensional, if you like.
Yeah, and you know, always as a designer, give full respect to your visual system. Remember that you have this remarkable pattern recognition tool, and it craves things. And I think another thing, David, about aesthetics, remember what I'm talking about is basic, you know, what you might call neuroaesthetics. All of these processes are unfolding at the millisecond level. That's what biologically you want. But human beings are far more than just a biological entity. You know, we've got intellect and consciousness. So what I love about aesthetics is it really is this game of mixing in those biological needs with what you like as a human being and as a scholar and whatever. And so aesthetics is this complete collision. And that's why some people might actually go against, that's why some art movements actually go against the neuroaesthetics. You know, think about acclaim, or, you know, a Rothko is really beautiful at the edges, but a Newman or something, very simple things. You know, if you wanted to criticize me, you could say, well, why would people like that artwork where it's clearly not fractal? And it emphasizes that when you talk about aesthetics, there's far more to our aesthetic appreciation than just our biological processes.
You've kind of preempted my next question there, which is exactly about that. What was that, as I understand it, that I like to sort of, I mean, I'm rather making a rather trite simplification, but it's nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
It's like we're born with this genetic response to what you call the millisecond neuroaesthetic response that we can't control. It's a result of us having lived in forests for millions of years, as developing as apes into Homo sapiens. And we can't control that. But the other side is the culture, the nurture, which is what we've been indoctrinated with as we've grown up, which is a very different thing. Like the Victorians in the 19th century grew up in these houses with multi-patterned wallpapers and hangings and furniture and things hanging off them, and all these complex details all around them. And in the 20th century, we had these blank white walls with nothing. And so there's totally different kind of cultural norms, which we can become accustomed to. And actually, we need that. We, as humans, we love to respond to the familiar. We're not very good at taking on something new and different. So if something's like what we've known it to be, we like that simply because it's familiar. So these two things kind of work against each other, don't they? They're quite kind of contradictory in some ways.
Yeah. And that's the beauty. That's the beauty of aesthetics. And I think, you know, where we're kind of going is that sure, when you're looking at a painting on a wall and you've got time to kind of think about it and think about culture and your views of aesthetics and think about it consciously, then that's one aesthetic. But when you're dashing for the aeroplane and you're stressed, then you tend not to think about some of those things and tend to revert back to just the neuroaesthetics and the, you know, what we were talking about earlier, the survival sort of aesthetic. But you're absolutely right that if you're walking down a corridor and you're consciously taking it in and you've got that, you know, that time ability, then what you've just been saying shows how important the other part of aesthetics, the cultural part, really is important. Otherwise, we would have been designing just all art would have been fractal, wouldn't it, forever? Yeah. And that would be a very boring world.
And the fascinating thing about the cultural side is that as an artist, you're always kind of one step ahead. I mean, there's no point in an artist doing what's been done before. I've seen that, I'm not interested. The value of art lies in its ability to kind of tweak our aesthetic and develop it and challenge it. And sometimes we like that challenge and we love it because it's different. Sometimes it's too uncomfortable and we can't take it. And so art's moving forwards. And you made a lovely comment in a conversation we had earlier that what was happening in the early 20th century was science was coming up with some new revelations, particularly with Einstein, and quite spontaneously, it's exactly the same time, artists were doing very similar things. And it's like there's these eruptions happened in our culture from somewhere deep down. They were connected maybe, or maybe there were simultaneous responses to what was happening. I don't know, but I love that kind of concept of science and art both popping up new things at the same time.
Yeah, and it's like tectonic plates, you know, they're building up a tension, and then there's a certain moment where things shift. And it's almost like society is pulling something out of a common ether, you know. And so Picasso and Einstein never met, but you know, people have written books about the parallels of their journeys into modernism, and there's certain parallels. And it's like just the time was right for these developments. And usually what fascinates me is that the scientists claim that they've discovered things, but in fact, usually artists have intuitively discovered them beforehand, because they really are testing the boundaries of aesthetics. And like you say, sometimes they take it too far and come back a little bit. But that's part of their duty to, you know, their role in life is that they're meant to be testing the boundaries. They're not producing bland wallpaper. They're meant to be pushing that envelope.
I mean, I would say it's the kind of artist imperative. That's the nature of artists, is that you can't sit on what you've done. You have this sort of uncomfortable drive to constantly push and explore and it's like we have very fine-tuned antennae which are picking up things maybe earlier than other people and responding to them and feeding them back, and it's kind of a feedback loop, because that also generates the direction in which we go aesthetically as well.
Yeah. And you know, Jackson Pollock, who, you know, that's how I kind of got into many of these things, the great, you know, abstract expressionist from the 1940s and 1950s, and he poured paint and generated fractal patterns. And he's a great demonstration, because his complexity in his early years, he's painted the D values that should relax you, but he swept right through that and painted higher D values. You know, and so there's a great artist who clearly had got the ability to paint these fractals, became a true expert in fractals, chose to sweep through that neuroaesthetics era and produce something more complex. And so that kind of demonstrates that for whatever reason, you know, whether it was his conscious thought or he wanted to push the boundaries or whatever, he moved beyond what the neuroaesthetics would say that you should be doing. And these are six images. Oh, thank you, of fractal images. And it's very hard to tell the Pollock from the natural ones.
And that was sort of interesting as well, that he needed to push it beyond the starting point and needed to kind of, I think that's also again, the artist thing, that we can't stand still, we have to keep moving, and maybe that took him into the bad territory. Maybe the work was actually any good by the end, but you're still driven to do this. You can't keep on creating the same thing.
Yeah, and I think the terrible thing about Pollock is that I think in the end, you know, he swept through that era, he produced this great art in the end, and that left him with nowhere to go. Because the art world really didn't, he really wanted to go back to figurative painting after that, because he felt he'd done everything. But the art world wouldn't let him do that. They wanted him to keep on painting what he'd already learned to do. And that was his end, really. Then he descended into alcoholism and was dead within 4 years. You know, just
the one that always interests me is Mondrian, who's best known for his very kind of geometric grids of just blues, reds and yellows and black. But if you follow his development, he started drawing trees. He started drawing fractals, and he gradually, he went the opposite way to Pollock. He reduced them and reduced them and reduced them until he, again, like Pollock, got to an end where he was stuck. He couldn't go any further. And that was like the end of Mondrian. Although he kept on trying for years, but he'd done it, hadn't he?
Yeah. That's right. And that's kind of sad, you know, well, it's fantastic that you achieved that artwork that, you know, you'll be remembered for, but they had essentially painted themselves into a box canyon where the rest of the world wouldn't let them walk out again. Yeah.
You did briefly mention other fractals apart from visual, and I don't know if there's any more you would say in that, but this idea of dynamic fractals, or fractals changing, you mentioned that as a topic you're exploring now. Is there more which we'd like to hear about that?
Yeah, so we're convinced that dynamic fractals would be more successful than static. So to give you an example, a static would be just you know, a still image of a tree, but we're more fascinated when we look at those branches and they're gradually swaying in the breeze. And that shows exactly the power of the visual system, that its goal is not to look at the simplest thing. It's to look at the thing that it's expected to look at. And so through evolution, it has, all of its pattern recognition tools have been honed based on the moving fractal. And that's what it wants to see, whether it's clouds moving across the sky, trees or flames flickering, or water, Sundance dancing on the, the river or something like that. And so that's going to be one of the challenges, I think, of design, is can you create dynamic fractals? And that's where I think windows and light is going to be very powerful, because if you can somehow, let's have an example. Let's say you created a fractal window shade that is bringing light in from the outside and casting a shadow on the ground. If that light is being subtly changed by clouds passing in front of the sun, then that will create dynamic fractals. Or with your lightings, if you can have something where the light source is subtly changing with time, then that will create the dynamic fractals that, that your visual system wants to look at.
But you don't think that's distracting? So if I'm in a restaurant or public space and I'm doing something, I'm in a library reading or talking to people in the restaurant, something like that, do you think it would be distracting to have that happening, or is that actually going to help me relax more?
I think this is the thing, we get back to context again. So let's say you, are thinking about something, and that's what you're doing. And let's say you're sat in front of a desk, then we have not done the experiments to prove this yet, but I think that if you were to be shown a light moving fractal, that will relax you. But let's say you're reading a book and you're trying to understand that text, then the moving shadows on that won't be appropriate. And so that's where we really do have to recognize that one fractal doesn't fit all, that we're going to carefully have to think about the functionality of the space in terms of thinking about what sort of fractal to put in there.
So what's your message to internal designers, interior designers, in terms of how we solve that problem, or how do we create something which is going to be there all the time, and a whole range of different people or experiences, and possibly even in different situations, without dumbing it down to the lowest common denominator? How do you achieve that?
Well, one way is to collaborate with a scientist like me, right? But there aren't many of us. But what I've learned, let me give you two examples of what I learned. That when I was working on authenticity of Jackson Pollock paintings, so there's lots of imitations out there, and the real paintings cost an enormous amount of money. So you've got to get this right. Now, what I used to do is use a computer to analyze the fractal content of Pollock's painting. But there was this scholar, the most famous Pollock scholar, a guy called Francis O'Connor, didn't know anything about mathematics, didn't know anything about fractals. So we used to do this game where when we got a new painting, my computer would analyze it and he would look at it. And we had complete agreement in terms of which ones were fake and which ones were real. And the take-home message there is that Francis O'Connor, of course, through evolution, had this fantastic fractal detector in his eyes, just as good as my computer detector. And then another example is, these Mohawk paintings that have been produced by these two Austrian designers, 13 and 9 Design. So the process there is that we would use the science to generate the images. Then the designers would move them around based on their artistic skills. They would send it back to me to analyze. And again, there was a complete consistency in terms of what they came up with and what the science would have predicted. So these examples show that you've just got to trust as a designer. Where is your design capabilities come from? It's from embracing your visual system and really understanding it. So I don't think that you need to know all the mathematics of fractals to become a good fractal designer. I think that you should go out there and walk in nature and look at trees a lot and look at clouds a lot and look at rivers a lot to get a really good intuitive feeling about what nature is doing. And then the designer should just trust in their skills. Go and walk into that building, say, okay, from what I know about my vision, how should I adapt that?
And the other issue is how much do you adapt that within that space? Like,
Yeah.
you know, do you cover the walls, the ceiling, the floor in patterns, or do you isolate areas in a frame like a picture, like this sort of thing? Or again, that's basically coming back to your artistic kind of aesthetic sense, isn't it, of trying to get a balance. I mean, you know the tools, the science gives you the tools, but then you have to apply your own sense to that, to just in that particular space to see how it works.
Yeah, because we've, you know, working separately, we've got, we're working with Mohawk on the fractal carpets. We're working with another company called Fractal Design on noise reducing ceilings. And then we're also developing window blinds. And then you start to think, well, what if you walk into a room where you've got the carpets, the ceilings, and the windows? Is that going to be just too much? Yeah. And it probably is. And that gets back to your earlier point that you've really got to take the whole environment. And that's why we're using this word atmospheric fractals, that you've got to understand the full atmosphere to decide what to put in there.
Mm. And I strongly believe that where we get that attuned sense of what works is in nature, is being out there and soaking it all up and allowing its kind of influence to kind of seep into every kind of aspect of what we do, so that when we come back and start working in our design application, that's feeding us, and we're not copying that. It's not like we've gone out there taking pictures, or we'll put that and put it here. It's a kind of assimilation process that then slowly kind of directs our designing back in the studio.
And in this complicated world that we're in at the moment, where people get criticized for cultural appropriation, you can't really get criticized for copying nature. That's still allowed.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I think we're fairly well through the questions. The only one I wanted to ask you finally was, and you might have even answered that already, is what next for Richard Taylor? You're working with a number of companies. Beyond that, have you got any kind of new exciting directions that this work might take you in?
Well, it's really interesting because it's something that has been fascinating me for years, just academically, fractals and you know, how do we respond to it from you know, a scientific point of view of understanding the visual system and an artistic view. But it's been really interesting over the last year with the pandemic. And I've just been watching the citations of my work just going up. And I think that that's an indication of people really now starting to realize that they've got to get more nature into their environment based on this sort of basic understanding that, you know, you have to go a long way before you find somebody who really doesn't like looking at nature, but in an everyday environment, they can't just go and walk into a forest. So I'm forming this laboratory of science and design here, where we're going to do experiments, you know, all of the things that we've been talking about, where really right now we're just at the start of this journey. But that's what I want to do, you know, professors in psychology, in design, in architecture, in physics. And then we're going to work, you know, I mentioned these two designers, 13 and 9. We're going to collaborate with them, do lots of experiments on things, and then try and reach out to manufacturers with this idea that if we can crack this, you know, like just the United States wastes $300 billion a year on stress-related illnesses. So if we can do these collaborations of subtly embedding fractals into the working environment, and we can improve societal health, I mean, that would be a fantastic thing to actually achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one lesson we've all learned from the pandemic is how important nature is, and being locked up in your flats, your apartment, your home, not being able to get out, you suddenly realize that those things you actually probably took for granted too much before are a really important part of our psyche, of our well-being, of having that. And I think we as designers have this great opportunity to grasp that knowledge, awareness, and and use it to make those spaces we live in actually more comfortable and more enriching.
Yeah. And it's if you scribble, just doodle, which I know a lot of designers do, and think when you're doing that, you're really enjoying that process. And if you just do it mindlessly, it's almost like surrealism. And, you will get back to a fractal pattern in the end. That's how much you crave it.
And I find I do that best when my conscious mind, my left brain, is engaged in some other activity, like talking on the phone or in a meeting or something. And I let my right brain just sort of doodle away, and because the left isn't interfering with it. The left is over here doing its own work. So now it's out the way, and the right can just happily kind of explore these patterns and things, and it starts to come out.
Yeah, and what I love about it is very much the sort of the inheritance from kind of some of the psychologists in the 1990s, where they were looking at trying to understand what's going on when you look out at nature. And they didn't know about fractals, but they were doing the basic experiments, and just the words that they used, for looking out at nature, they called it soft fascination. Well, when you're reading a book, they call that hard fascination. That you're having to really concentrate on reading the book. When you look out at the scene, even though it's from data, just as complicated as the typing on the screen, but because that complex data is what you want, that's soft fascination. And so it doesn't wear you out. Reading the book is actually wearing out your mental resources. Going back and staring out at the nature is actually restoring all of those resources, and will stop, burnout and fatigue.
Yeah, great. That's what we're trying to do with all our designs and our lighting.
Yeah, yeah.
We've opened this up to Q&A. If anybody wants to send in questions for Richard or even of me, if you want as well, please do by the Q&A panel. We've got one from Jane Downs, and she's asking, how do colors and textures fit in with these ideas?
It's a great question. So textures can be fractal. And I think you mentioned that, David, when you were talking about those light patterns, that you can have background textures that can add to the fractal. And those should all be taken into account. So with the carpets, one of the big challenges was the tufting texture on which we put our patterns. So all of that has to be taken into account. And color is another extra thing, and very important for stress reduction. And it just shows that fractals are not enough. So if I were to show you the same image in the background and put bright red instead of blue, then that would really diminish the ability of the fractal to actually reduce your stress level. So all of these things really matter. So
you're saying that a red color is stressful and a blue color is not, but that's not a fractal thing. That's the kind of wavelength.
Yeah, so I should say that when you hear me talking, it sounds like everything's to do with fractals. But as you know, as a designer, there are many extra things that you have to get right in addition to the fractal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We don't have any more questions. If nothing else comes in, then maybe we should wrap this up. Anything else you want to add, Richard?
No, just thank you for inviting me. And I do like your lightings. I think they're fantastic. And yeah, I just think that if we all do embrace this, we will be doing society an enormous help. And I think the time is right. I think, that we've got all of the technologies and things that we can, use to actually generate all these fractals.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. So, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. It's been another exciting and really enriching debate that I've really enjoyed. I hope everybody else has too.
We'll do part 3 in 9 months.
Yes. Yeah, right on.
Thank you for inviting me, David.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you, Richard. And part 3 might be live in Austin, Texas, when you come and visit us, both of you. And so thanks to all the attendees today. We will follow up with some email, of course, and some posting. Anyone that, any colleague that might have missed this, it is recorded. It will be on our website. And then just as a little sales pitch, we will be participating in Close Up, which is the digital version of Wanted Design and ICFF. We'll be participating in that in mid-May. So we will communicate that. And then the next From the Edge will be the end of June. And David is going to be talking about design stories from Aotearoa, New Zealand. We've got an exciting new guest, Jamie McClellan from Allbirds, the famous shoe company from New Zealand. So lots going on and lots to look forward to. But thanks again, Richard. Thanks again, David. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.